Thanks, Jackie. That's great. And thank you to Colors of Freedom and State Parks and John Brown Lives for all pitching in to make this happen. It's a thrill to present here on our Juneteenth today. I'm wondering if this is loud enough. Is there a way to make it louder?
I don't know if it's on.
Oh, it might not be on. Here comes Brendan.
Oh.
What do you think, Brendan?
That was supposed to be on. Did it get turned off? Yep, someone turned it off. There we go.
This might be better,
It's much better when the electricity's going through it.
It's so much better, yeah. I'm going to read this talk, because if I didn't, we'd be here for a really long time instead of the hour we have for this. The title of it is called An Unsettled Debate, Garrett Smith's Black Pioneers, Fugitives, or Free New Yorkers. And this is just a subject that has interested me as long as I've been researching it, as long as I've been researching the larger story. I found my perfect subhead for this talk a day or two ago. It's a quote from a novel by the British novelist Julian Barnes. With apologies to the Clinton County historian Helen Nurska, the quote is, "History isn't what happened. History is just what historians tell us." This talk is about what historians have been telling us about Garrett Smith's black grantees who responded to his offer of free Adirondack land lots and moved to this part of Essex and Franklin counties to farm so they could gain the right to vote. Were they fugitives? Or, as later chroniclers insisted, free men in New York State? Each narrative advanced an agenda, but did these agendas honor facts? Why one reading in one century and its repudiation in another? But before I dive into the drama of this story as it was represented or misrepresented on the page, a brief summary for those of you who might be unfamiliar with the saga and its leading players. And forgive me, Evan, if I repeat a little bit of what you already explained. I don't think it can hurt to hear it twice, though. From 1821 until 1870, as you may know, black New Yorkers could not vote without showing that they owned $250 in real property. In 1846, the land baron Garrett Smith from Peterborough announced his plan to give away 120,000 acres, most of it in northern New York, to 3,000 black New Yorkers who met his terms of eligibility, namely poverty, a devotion to temperance, a New York State address, and the capacity to work their gift land. The objective was twofold. He wanted to enable a migration of urban black families from city neighborhoods and work sites where the living was dangerous and unhealthy, good jobs elusive, advancement slow, and white negrophobia unrelenting. In the country, Smith believed, his grantees could start fresh on their own terms, save money, and eventually meet the terms of the voting requirement and gain the vote. No wild 40-acre gift lot was worth any 250, as Evan already pointed out, but with improvements over time, the value would accrue. Sweat equity was part of Smith's plan too. He could have given bigger lots or cash gifts outright that would enfranchise his grantees, but this missed the point. A bracing encounter with the rigors of the Adirondack wilderness, Smith believed, would work out a far better character than if his grantees had an over-easy time of it. Or, as he put it, worked their farms on fat lands under genial suns. New York's northern frontier would be a proving ground of black manhood and worthiness for citizenship. The grantees had only to get up there and start. To vet and sign on his grantees, Smith enlisted 13 activists around the state, some white, more black, and divided them into committees. And I gotta find my page because I'm out of order. Bear with me. This is just curious. Hold on a sec. I think I had two versions of this, and that got me a little screwed up. Okay, divided them into committees and assigned each committee to different swaths of New York State, and every committee had a quota to meet from its swath. These were multi-county swaths. The one that ranged from the Hudson River Valley reached from Peekskill or Westchester north up to Canada. That was a lot of land to cover, so these grantees had their work cut out for them, but in full years they pulled it off. This part of what Smith called a scheme of justice and benevolence went well. They had distributed 3,000 gift deeds to as many grantees. How did the pundits and the press respond to this? Unsurprisingly, reviews of Smith's endeavor reflected the political allegiances of the authors. The anti-slavery papers, like Garrison's The Liberator, the Albany Patriot, Northern Star and Colored Farmer, National Era, Frederick Douglass's The North Star, and Willis Hodge's Ram's Horn, endorsed it unequivocally. Whig editors were more cautious. Some gave it a nod, but in Oswego, Rochester, and Cortland, Whig writers questioned the value of the land, sterile and worthless, one paper claimed, and worried that Smith had given up land he still owed taxes on, wrongly offering that all of Smith's gift lots was in John Brown's tract, and that's not our John Brown, that's the land speculator John Brown, who had a lot of land in Hamilton County. The Oswego Advertiser declared, quote, "the woods so dense as to be almost impervious to the axe of the settler," and, quote, "the flies, punkies, gnats, gallinippers, and mosquitoes of Hamilton County may challenge for comparison any that ever presented bill on the banks of the Rio Grande. They will draw blood, we might also say through his very boots. A Nantucket Yankee who has learned to draw sustenance from the bare rocks and desert sands of his native shores might possibly live there. The Negro, unused to self-dependence, never could." From the ranks of Democrats, ardent foes of Smith's radical abolitionism, came predictably incredulity and derision. A leading Essex County historian and Democrat, Winslow Watson, sounded a death knell for Smith's giveaway as early as 1854. Quote, "Whatever may have been the motive of the benefaction, the experiment has entailed only disappointment and suffering upon the recipients of the gratuity, while the act has exercised a sinister and depressing influence upon the prosperity and reputation of the country," meaning the county. The Negro, ill-adapted in his physical constitution to the rigorous climate, with neither experience nor competency to the independent management of business affairs, and adverse to them from all habits and propensities, soon felt the inappropriateness of his condition. The grantee settlers, Watson claimed, had abandoned their freeholds in disappointment and disgust, and become, quote, "in many instances, an impoverished and destitute object of public or private charity." Some grantees would indeed move away, but many hunkered down, and for the record, no poorhouse record that I reviewed in Essex or Franklin County in 1854 was home to any Smith grantee or registered that any grantee was staying in a poorhouse. As for the low numbers, in 1850, Smith reported, sadly, that only 50 grantees were living on his gift land. My math gins up a number more like 200 plus when I count wives and children and extended households, fellow travelers who had no gift deed but bought land on their own because they liked the idea, and freed people who moved here after the Civil War at the urging of Union soldiers, black and white, who sketched a John Brown country very distant from the slave lands they had known. Admittedly, 250 people over a 30-year stretch would not have impressed a land baron banking on 3,000. And I don't think we should blame Smith for turning to more direct anti-slavery work. In Cazenovia, Smith organized an integrated rally of abolitionists and fugitives to protest the new fugitive slave law in 1850. He bankrolled relief groups that were guiding freedom seekers north. funded immigrant parties who were bound for bleeding Kansas and determined to vote the free soil ticket and to keep the scourge of slavery out of this contested territory. Smith went to Congress. As Evan said, for part of his first term, he railed against the slave power until he realized nobody was listening, and then he quit, and began to underwrite the more militant, extra-legal tactics now favored by his friend John Brown. From both Smith's and Brown's perspectives, the effort to fight the slaveocracy politically through, say, an attempt to enfranchise Black New Yorkers with gifts of wild land was just too slow working to meet the urgent, desperate need of the enslaved millions. And when Smith and Brown pivoted away from the Black Woods, historians did too. But there are more perspectives to be considered than John Brown's and Gerrit Smith's. 200-plus arrivals on an underpopulated frontier in eager need of pioneers made a difference. And though Smith never knew it, his and the agent's shared vision of a peaceably integrated frontier, whereas his land agent, Charles Ray, memorably predicted mutual assistance, mutual and equal dependence, mutual sympathy, and labor, the common destiny of the American people, yields equally to all and makes all equal, did in small pan out. On the gift land, a rough, imperfect parity was realized. Black and white pioneers shared town appointments, fire watcher, fence viewer, constable, inspector of elections. They brought their potatoes to the same starch factory, buried their dead in the same rural cemeteries, went to church together, and sent their children to the same drafty schools. Mountain hikes, ball games, Christmas feasts, and field work were shared pursuits. In one hamlet, white neighbors stood by an elderly grantee when a speculator tried to wrest his farm from him. In Franklin, white neighbors of John Thomas, once enslaved, talked a bounty hunter out of trying to arrest him. Not only is he armed and ready for you, the interloper was informed, if you go after him, we'll take his side. The man-thief took his leave. Town records and the census in St. Armand, Franklin, and North Elba, where most of the Black settlers lived, suggest that Black men did gain the vote. The grantee settler, Lyman Epps' devotion to Election Day was noted in his town paper. He never missed an election. Land redemption records I found in the state archives hold affidavits from Black Franklin farmers describing their white neighbors' farm improvements, and white neighbors vouching for the working farms of their Black neighbors, too. Critical testimony for these poor farmers hoping to save their properties from confiscation for overdue back taxes. Some Black volunteers from the gift lands were admitted to white regiments, and after the Civil War, when Black veterans tapped their white neighbors to back their bids for better pension settlements for war-incurred injuries, their friends stepped up in force. The sons of the grantee Avery Hazard helped co-found the Brookside Cemetery. The oldest of the Hasbrook boys camped out for the night on Whiteface Mountain with white Adirondack friends, including John Brown's daughter. White farm families put up Black people, and in the households of grantees in New Russia, Westport, and Willsboro, it worked the other way. But none of this is represented in the popular assessments of Smith's effort on the page, especially after Harper's Ferry and the identification of John Brown with the slaves. Make sure I got this right. Nope, missing a page. Hold on. It's 8. It's a slippery one. I saw it before. Here it is. I found it. So I'll start that sentence again. Especially after Harper's Ferry and the identification of John Brown with the cause of the slave, an Adirondack narrative took shape that enlisted the grantees in a script they never asked for. Nothing wrong with the story of a suffrage justice strategy to gain the right to vote, but how much more dramatic and affecting if the black farmers came because of Brown. If Brown himself actually rescued them. If Brown, as Richard Henry Dana, the writer, recalled in his essay on his visit here, was esteemed by the black fugitives around him as a kind of king. How much richer his sojourn here might seem if all around him were these unfortunate and helpless slaves. Speaking literally, this angle could do so much more for this story. John Brown, a redeemer. Thus was John Brown's heroism burnished at history's expense. Let the Negroes, helpless, needy, grateful, be indebted to John Brown and then let them disappear, because they had to disappear. This was another selling point of the fugitive idea too, not just how escaped slaves in the neighborhood stood for the mission and devotion of John Brown, but how their prompt and voluntary disappearance underscored their unfitness for this place, and how mistaken was the notion they belonged here. An utter failure, judged Adirondack historian Frederick Seaver in 1877. The children of the sunny South could not tame the northern wilderness. No fault of theirs. They lacked the skill, the grit, the capacity to manage the white man's northern New York woods. On his death in 1897, Lyman Epps, the Connecticut-born pioneer who got his gift deed in Troy, would be reconstituted in the Brooklyn Eagle as, quote, one of the slaves brought here by the Underground Railroad. The New York Times obit went one better, said Brown brought Epps north himself. As early as Brown's funeral, Epps would be described as the only black farmer who stuck around. Within a year, an AP article pronounced the rest had all lost heart and fled. To his readers, Alfred Donaldson observed in his regional history, with his usual measured flair, quote, the attempt to combine an escaped slave with the so-called Adirondack farm was about as promising of agricultural results as would be the placing of an Italian lizard on a Norwegian iceberg. A close reading of the census reveals several black North Elbans farming in North Elba and in Franklin as late as 1870. Not much after, in St. Armand, actually into the 20th century, and in other rural Adirondack districts outside this immediate region, even longer. In fact, the last self-acknowledged descendant of a Smith grantee who lived near here died last year, pretty recently. But close census readings were not the habit of antiquarian historians, furnishing their readership with the anecdotes and yarns that aim to please. So missing in this new confected history any mention of the New York towns and cities that grantee settlers once called home, where they came from. No mention of the roots of Smith's idea in a campaign for racial suffrage justice in New York State. New York racism was off the hook. Even when historians recognized the pioneers as Northern, they borrowed the racialized cliche of the slaves' helpless incapacity to describe them. Asserted Gerrit Smith's biographer, Octavius Brooks Frothingham, in 1878, on the best land they would have done nothing. They had none of the qualities that make the farmer. Had the land been the richest in the state, they would not have responded, for they could not. It was not in them. Almost half a century later, E.P. Tanner revived this verdict for the State Historical Association, blaming the failure of Smith's giveaway on the character of the colonists who naturally had neither the training nor the stuff in them for pioneering. Note, I keep emphasizing those parts that make it an issue of helpless, innate incapacity. The unfitness of the grantees for this country was a biological problem. It was their nature. It was nothing they could help. Northern white supremacism was exonerated. No mention of the role of Smith's black agents, their visits to the Black Woods, their detailed reports in Frederick Douglass's North Star. Black voices were scrubbed. And was it accidental that this fake news of the unassimilable, incompetent, unresourceful Black pioneer starts cropping up in force in the last third of the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th, when Eastern cities are thronged with Eastern and Southern European immigrants and Black refugees from the South, and old stock Anglophones are discovering a rationale for their anxiety about this in the burgeoning new field of eugenics. The suggestion that the Black pioneers were not just fugitives, but incapable of taking root, adjusting, would be a fable, a usable fable of unfitness for Adirondack life. There were people who got to call themselves Adirondackers and others who better not. What happened to the Black grantees in regional histories would also be the literary fate of indigenous people, Francophones, Southern and Eastern European laborers, peddlers, hobos, gypsies, Chinese people coming down from Canada, migratory work crews who weren't and never could be Adirondackers. Their stories would go missing. Mostly they still are. As to the late 20th century, I'm going to jump to this, the Restoration and the time of the restoration of free Black New Yorkers to this history. Some of you who've read my book know my arguments with Lake Placid's late historian Mary Mackenzie are legion. But credit where it's due, Mackenzie was the first to challenge the undocumented assumption that Gerrit Smith's grantees were all fugitives, and to do the spade work that gave these grantees lives, families, homes, and full-bore biographies in her book chapter, The North Elba Colored Colony, From the Plains of Abraham, A History of North Elba and Lake Placid. Assiduously charting the arrival and departure of each Black settler in her territory, the location of their land lots, their progress on their cabins, when they came, when they left, their dealings with white neighbors, especially John Brown's family, who knew many of the grantees well and counted several of them as good friends. Mackenzie and her ally, Ed Cotter, longtime site manager of the John Brown Farm Historic Site, took keen aim at Alfred Donaldson's assertion the grantees were Southern slaves with no aptitude for Adirondack life. Mackenzie's mission to expose this claim as the injurious and racist claptrap it was. But Cotter's fierce devotion to Brown's story and Mackenzie's monofocus on her own turf, not even Essex County, North Elba, and Lake Placid, both more or less one, burdened both of them with blinders that curbed their wider view. When parks the Parks Department of New York State, which includes historic sites, approached these local lay historians with ambitious plans for an interpretive center on this site, which might have unpacked the backstory of Gerrit Smith's idea, Cotter pushed back hard. Visitors to this site, he wrote, knew nothing of this, quote, obscure 19th century reformer. Of the thousands of people who visit the site every year, only a mere handful have ever heard of Gerrit Smith and his, this is italicized, Negro colony. Talk with our foreign visitors, members of the John Brown Memorial Association, and visitors we get from all over our country reveals that they are interested in what John Brown tried to do for human rights, not in Gerrit Smith's failures. That human rights for John Brown was not restricted to slavery's legal abolition, but meant enfranchisement and other perquisites of citizenship, was undeniable, but a distraction, Cotter felt. Any focus on Timbuktu, on the story of this enclave and the others elsewhere in North Elba and in Franklin, would dilute the bigger focus, would dilute the point of this place. Mackenzie objected to Park's proposal for another reason. An interpretive center, she told her garden club, would inevitably offer gritty, even unsavory information about Brown's bloody work in Kansas that would compromise the mood and serenity of this site and make it less of a shrine. More history, she worried, could do nothing. and would distract. It's not what anyone wanted, not what they expected, not what they were used to here. And Mackenzie and Connor got mobilized. Their grassroots campaign against a state interpretive center in the late 1870s is why you don't see one here today. Their war on the idea of ex-slaves in North Elba was particularly vigilant. Cotter and Mackenzie knew about the young fugitive, Cyrus Thomas, right? Thank you. Yes. The Brown family harbored and employed in their first home on the Cascade Pass. The Browns resolved to protect him from slave hunters is well documented in their letters. They were aware of the black farmer John Thomas and his thank you note to Gerrit Smith that detailed his many decades in bondage. He wasn't a North Elba guy, he was just north in Franklin, but even so. And they were aware of Seaver's paragraph about the bounty hunters who got as far as Franklin before they were apprised of Thomas's defiance and his neighbors' determination to defend him. In eastern Essex County, operatives on the Underground Railroad, named and noted in local history, were some of them John Brown's friends, John Brown's, who else? Lyman Epps Jr. testifies to activities to slaves passing through this farm, abetted by the Brown family, and Alexis Hinckley.
Alexis Hinckley, in his GAR, Grand Army of the Republic,
Right.
obituary,
Yeah.
said that he had been active on the Underground Railroad here.
Right here in North Elba.
Yes.
It didn't matter, thank you, what was going on in nearby Franklin or Elizabethtown or Wilmington was no concern of the lococentric North Elba town historian. She hewed to her turf, and why she turned deaf ears to this other, more local story, I still don't quite get. That's an interesting question. But her sense of her turf, as she saw it, did not reflect, let me put this more clearly, her identification, her disregard for what was happening in Franklin and elsewhere where black grantee settlers lived, because she would argue, and did with me sometimes, that she had to only focus on what was happening in her own hometown, did not acknowledge how people actually behaved and lived. And the black grantees who lived here had acquaintances and married and socialized with black farmers to the north. And in New Russia, in Elizabethtown, there was considerable intercourse, social intercourse, there always is, between people who have things in common. Jewish peddlers did the same thing, French Canadians did the same thing, the black grantees did the same thing, and did not pay attention to the borders of their town when they sought the company of their intimates. And she didn't really grasp that, or didn't want to see that. She didn't pay close attention. She didn't want to acknowledge the possibility of Willis Hodges, a grantee who moved to Blacksville on Loon Lake, that he might have been assisting fugitives up there and been working with John Brown. It's difficult to document it because the letters that might have proved it were burnt by Hodges' wife when Brown was arrested at Harper's Ferry, but a son or grandson of Hodges remembers being told that Hodges did assist fugitives on the Underground Railroad, and this was known to Connor and Mackenzie. Mackenzie still was not compelled by black memory. She discounted Hodges' account and the memory of Lyman Epps about the Lyman Epps Jr., about the welted back of his grandmother, once enslaved. Candace Epps lived with the Eppses in North Elba. Mackenzie's brusque dismissal of this memory implied that Epps had made it up. Mackenzie's vigilance in this case was particularly self-serving, but evidence was rich in presumably slave-free North Elba, of an overlap between the free black New Yorkers and the once enslaved. And now I'm sort of bearing down on my point. There were elders who lived with younger farm families who were surely old enough to have been enslaved in their youth. And while Smith's grantees were living in New York when they got deeds, they might have been self-freed at some point and might well have been regarded by their enslavers, their former enslavers, as self-stolen property in need of reclamation. Think of James Henderson's aged Virginia-born mother, Sally, born in the era of slavery, almost surely enslaved herself. Think of Louisa Brady in Franklin County, who fled with her young son and husband from Maryland and Delaware and moved to the Smith lands in the 1850s. The route of her flight and the circumstances of her arrival and her obituary describe her as an escaped slave. In her zeal to welcome the black colony to the ranks of North Elba's pioneers, I sense the late town historian aimed to downplay any information that might call them out as different. In North Elba, they were starting fresh. This was her emphasis, and it was a democratizing and well-intended emphasis, but I think it was mistaken. The black farmers were not like their white neighbors. The white neighbors were not burdened with the lasting legacy of slavery and the white supremacism that had rationalized it. The enactment of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850 did not fill them with dread. It would not tempt white Adirondackers to flee to Canada. The white neighbors of the black grantees had not moved here from Brooklyn, Troy, Manhattan, the Hudson River Valley to gain the right to vote and gain the farms that would make them economically independent. This wasn't their rationale. They already had the vote. The likeness doesn't hold. We now have the blessing and advantage of access to archival sources that were unavailable to an earlier generation of historians, and we know more because of this. We know the Jefferson brothers, first two settlers in Timbuktu, which is really a three-farm enclave, but has gained a much more resonant meaning since those days. We know they were likely born enslaved, and Josiah Hasbrook too. Don Papson of the Underground Railroad Museum wrote a beautiful essay in 2009 in the North Country Lantern itemizing the many ex-slaves to whom Gerrit Smith knowingly gave grants. Ex-slaves, but maybe not in the eyes of their former enslavers. That's the point I'm making. At least one of these unknowingly in my book is the story of Stephen Pembroke, who got an Adirondack gift deed on the shore of Lake Mirror when he was still enslaved. His escaped brother, a prominent New York City abolitionist and a friend of Gerrit Smith, and several of the land agents, was the one to make this happen. Maybe Smith knew, maybe not. Another blurry line. The lines that seemed to an earlier generation so strict and defensible between, say, human rights and black civil rights, or this town's history and that one's, or the freedom seeker and the free New York resident, no longer seem so clear or even useful. These lines were porous. Fugitive or free New Yorker? Some were both. Acknowledge this duality, embrace it, and work with the contradiction here and accept this as a real fact of life. And we can hope to grant this rich, complicated chapter of our history its due. Thanks very much. I got a little scrambled there at the end. I'm sorry, but you get the point. People can be two things at once, and there was this emphasis from the historians to sectionalize the history, make slavery a Southern problem, and make the North free of that tarnish, a land of sublime freedom, welcome, and tolerance. And it wasn't that simple. That's all I'm saying. And for more, you should go to the exhibit upstairs if you haven't seen it. But better than that, you should buy my book. That's what you should do. It's hot in here, but are there some questions? Do we have time, or do we have to push out? Okay. Anybody? Sandra.
Well, first of all, Mary McKenzie job was as the town historian of North Delaware and Lake Placid. So that was her territory, that was her job, that was what she was supposed to be doing.
Too limitedly defined, in my view.
Well, you can tell that to every town historian.
I could, I will, I do.
But Mary McKenzie was doing her job that she was tasked with. And the reason that Ed Cotter and Mary McKenzie were so into trying to talk about that this was not a place of fugitive slaves was because they were fighting the Donaldson and the decades and decades and decades of the theory, as you talked about, that the false theory that this was a colony of fugitive slaves from the South and that John Brown was running an underground railroad.
Oh, I get it, I agree.
You know, that's completely false.
Yes.
So that's what they were fighting against, and that's why they emphasized those points so much.
What's missing was the acknowledgement that there were fugitives. They went so far to deny the existence of any fugitive slave here to make that point. I don't think the history of the overlap of the fugitive and the free black New Yorker, free only in New York State, not for his enslavers after 1850, was acknowledged or explored. I agree with you, though, that was their thing.
Yeah, but there were only a few fugitive slaves. That wasn't the point of the experiment. It wasn't the intention of it. That's not what it was about.
Well, I don't know. I mean, Gerrit Smith was the last person in the world to declare, to make this whole thing unpalatable and illegal before it even started, and to declare it a refuge for fugitive slaves would have been incredibly incendiary at that time. So he had his reasons for being discreet, and we don't know, I think, everything about his motives. So, yes, the stated motive was to provide poor black New Yorkers with property and get them closer to the voting booth. But among those poor black New Yorkers were a good many people, at least in the grantees, who were born enslaved, who escaped slavery, and who were not yet clear and free of the interest of their former enslavers. So there's overlap. That's all I'm saying.
And just one more comment. Lyman Epps Jr., Lyman Epps Sr. told facts and told the truth. When you look at what his son, Lyman Epps Jr., has told, he said that his parents were slaves and he was brought here in a cart by John Brown. He said all kinds of things that we know are not true. So I don't know. I can't take anything that he says as a reliable source.
I can't discount a memory of his grandmother. That seems like such an intimate thing. You're right, it could have been confected, but he said enough that hit the money for me to believe that one. But I have my bias too, so, you know. Martha.
Thanks for a great talk again. I have a question. Have you, in all of your years of research, come upon any women in the ledger that have received?
Yeah, there are about 4. One's from St. Lawrence County. Her name's Flora Fry. This is an interesting story. She gets land, and the assumption among the judges of this is that people who didn't move here had no use for these deeds. They'd kept them but didn't do anything with them. Quite a few grantees used and she's one of them, used their land to buy property to improve their circumstances. She sold her deed to buy her own home, first ever, and stayed in her family for several generations in Gouverneur, am I saying that right?
Governor.
Thank you. And that's evidence of use. Many other ways in which the grantees used their land that were never evident to Gerrit Smith. A lawsuit reveals that 300-400 grantees, not settlers, keep their deeds, though they never move to their land, for the help it does them on election day. And keep them, we know this, because they only let them go in 1870, which is the year when all Americans, irrespective of race and former condition of servitude, are granted the right to vote. And that's when they let them go, and a black speculator buys them all up. And the reporter describes this as a response to the 15th Amendment. They held on to the deeds because until they didn't need them in order to vote. That's another instance of using it that he didn't know. Several of the land agents used their deeds and bought more deeds to speculate and make money to support their anti-slavery work. So it plays a role in their circumstances too. Yeah, sure. Someone else. Well, it's time to bust up then. Thank you. I'm going to be signing books. I hope you buy one. Thank you.